What's up guys, Tony here from Epic, and today we're going to talk about monitoring your training, why monitoring your training is important, and some ways that you can actually do that. So we'll get right into it. Our overview today, we'll talk about why we need to monitor, we'll talk about the volume to load management, we'll talk about RPE, RIR, and auto regulation. So first we'll discuss why you would even want to monitor your training, and some considerations that you need to think about how you go about doing that. It all starts with a needs analysis. Somehow you need to look at where you are and where you want to be and establish how you're going to get there, or how your athlete is going to get there if you're the coach. You have to know a little bit about them, the stressors they have in their life, what kind of training they have been doing, what kind of training they should be doing for their sport, for their wherever they are with their progression, if they need to work on strength or speed or explosiveness or something along those lines. Whatever it is they need to work on, you have to establish that. And then you need to think about it objectively, how you're going to get there. A lot of times during the needs analysis, you may also want to start with some assessments, rep maxes or something along those lines, time trials, somewhere you can have a baseline to establish where you're going to go from there. If you don't have this information, then you need to get it somehow. Rough estimates will work for most people. If you have an elite level athlete, you probably already have this information available to you anyway, like what speed they're running, for example. What do you need to do to get them on a path to making progress? With that, knowing the difference between objective and subjective metrics and how those can be used to help you progress. Objective metrics will be those from an outside source. A lot of times we use technology to help us with that, and it can be as simple as using time, the load. For most people, those two things are probably going to be just fine. It depends on their sport, if they're even applicable. But there are other options like force output, where you're using force plates or accelerometers or something like that. Some technology to help you see exactly what's happening when they perform a lift, or when they're performing whatever skills there are, like sprint work or something like that. The objective metrics, take the guesswork out of it, and you can get a much more accurate picture of where they are. The subjective metrics, while they should probably be used sparingly, they can also still be pretty useful. Things like how the athlete is actually feeling during their training, and you bring in things like RPE, and that is a subjective metric that the athlete is telling you, I felt that this particular training session or this exercise was however intense it felt to them. But the subjective metrics, they're important as well. I think about objective metrics and subjective metrics kind of like signs and symptoms. Some are more objective, and then you have the subjective portion as well. As long as you know the difference between the two, and you're not trying to incorporate subjectivity into objective metrics or vice versa, just make sure you delineate between the two. It's important to be able to do that. Understanding the variables in your training and accounting for them. If your training is going well, you should still consider ways that other variables are going to be affecting your training. One particularly common variable that gets thrown in the mix for virtually any athlete is going to be injuries. Injuries come up. There's never a good time for an injury, but it's just a product of the training. Some sports more than others. So if you have an injury, it doesn't mean you have to stop training. In most cases, sometimes that's a good idea. But a lot of times you have an injury, you need to find a way to work around it. Maybe working that region of the body is something that gets taken off the table for a little while, and you come back to it when you can. Slowly incorporate the exercises. They're going to help you get back to where you were before the injury occurred. But most of the time, if you have an injury, you should be able to work around it without having to stop training altogether. If appropriate, have the athlete focus on the rehabilitation, finding exercises they can substitute the exercises they normally would be doing for their new normal, dealing with the injury, and just circumvent the injury as best you can. When the athlete is complaining of pain, that's when my ears kind of perk up, and if I see them doing a movement, it looks like it's being performed correctly, but it's still causing them pain, that's a problem. We need to assess what's actually going on with them. Pain versus discomfort. Competitive athletes should be able to understand the difference between pain and discomfort. It's not pain like, oh, this exercise, it burns, so that's not pain. That's just part of the process. Pain meaning that the sharp pain a lot of times, or if they have some other condition, or maybe they're recovering from injury, they thought they were recovered from an injury. If you're having pain in an area that you shouldn't be having pain in during an exercise, that's a little red flag for me. So I want to assess what they're doing, how they're doing it, and maybe get them over to the right people to get looked at if they need to. Other variables. Variables in the movements themselves. There are too many individual differences to say that a movement should be performed exactly the same way for every person. A back squat is a great example. When an individual squats, you may have a little more forward lean or backward lean, depending on the individual. Not just the height of the person, but also the femur length and some other variables like ankle mobility or hip mobility. It may interfere with their ability to get into a deep squat. Maybe deep squatting isn't the best for that person. Maybe they're still getting a lot of stimulus out of their method of squatting. As long as it's not dangerous, causing them pain, you're probably fine with them doing it to the best of their ability. I would not focus on trying to get everybody to squat exactly the same. It's just a variable that you may have to contend with. Some people just do it a little bit differently, just the way they're made. Transferability to sport. There's going to be some differing perspectives on this. In my opinion, we can focus too much on what are seen as highly transferable movements to a given sport that aren't necessarily all that important for the strength and conditioning side of things. You're going to get sport-specific work out of the skills training as a product of preparing for the sport, preparing for the competition, the season, whatever. So I don't think you need to focus so much on the transferability of the movements to the sport. I'd focus more on a perspective of, is this a sport where we need power and explosiveness? Is this a sport where strength is going to play out? Is this a sport where muscle size matters? Is this a sport where you need to be fast? You need to, whatever the variables of that sport are, the things that you're training for. I think you should, more of a focus should be on that opposed to actual movements, trying to mimic what comes along in the sport. Now that's assuming the athlete is doing a lot of skills training that goes along with the strength and conditioning, which if you're preparing for a competition, you likely are. If you aren't, then maybe you could incorporate more sport-specific movement into the training, but I don't think we need to be focusing so much on that. Instead, I would focus on macro movements that are going to help us develop the types of athletes that we need, that explosiveness or the strength, et cetera, that kind of stuff that we need, and develop more potential for transferability to the sport. So take heavy squats, for example. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a sport where heavy squats isn't going to have a lot of transferability to a given sport. That doesn't mean that we need to do any types of movements that are like squatting movements that are so specific to a given sport. But the squats in general are probably a good idea to incorporate. It allows for greater potential for that sport-specific movement down the line. Now, as you get closer to the competition or season, depending on your sport, then you can start incorporating more of these highly transferable movements. They're mimicking what you'll see in the sport. That to me makes a lot more sense than dedicating so much time of your strength and conditioning as you prepare for competition or in your off season. That makes a lot more sense than doing it all the time. Remember, we want to increase our potential for performance through strength and conditioning. So let's talk about volume load management, what that looks like. The relationship between volume and load, you can see it expressed in many different ways. There are two equations I want to show you today that are the simplest versions of tracking your volume, your training volume. It's easy to do, and I'll show you ways you can set it up to make it very simple. You don't have to think about it while you're training, or you can just make your notes and do the math later on. Sometimes some of these equations, the more advanced equations, require technology. You'll need an accelerometer, force plates, GPS, something along those lines. These equations, you don't need any of that, and that's why I've only chosen these two specifically, because that's I like keeping it simple. And that technology is really expensive. Unless you're in a human performance lab at a university, you're probably not even going to have access to this stuff. So we'll just try to keep it simple. So your overall training volume, it's based on the assumption that your training intensity is high enough to begin with. It's not as easy as saying we need to manipulate these, what are going to be three variables. Manipulate these three variables and you're automatically going to increase your volume, and it's going to have an effect. You will increase the training volume by increasing some of these variables, but it's not going to have the same effect if you just go crazy with one while leaving the others behind. You have to still maintain at least a moderate level of intensity across the board, and that's going to be monitored by the volume load management equations. But you also need to feel that training. It needs to feel at least some fatiguing effort in your training. If you're not, then none of this really matters to begin with. So training intensity, this equation we'll look at, it's very simple. Volume load equals reps times sets times load. This equation was made with the load in kilograms. So keep that in mind. If you're just an individual who's training on their own, or you're not in an elite environment where the using kilograms is important, I probably wouldn't worry about it too much. If you're using pounds or kilos, it doesn't really matter. As long as you stick with one and you are consistent with that, or if you want to convert it down the line, whatever the case is, but just understand that this was made with kilograms in mind. So for this equation, for example here, we've got a volume load of 10 reps, 4 sets at 100 kilos equals 4,000 kilograms. That's our volume that we've calculated here. And what you can do, what I have done in the past is I've put this in an Excel document in a formula. So each cell is going to represent a portion of the formula. So I'll just put in the reps, sets, and the load and let the Excel document do the math for me so I can continue training, or I'll just take notes while I'm training and I can put this in later. What that allows you to do is later, as the weeks go on, you can plot your volume over time, and you'll chart it out, and you can see if your volume is increasing. Pair that with other objective and subjective metrics, or how your training is going. You can actually graph it and see how you're progressing. Are you making progress? It's one thing to feel like you're making progress. It's something totally different to look on a chart and say, yes, our volume is increasing, my strength is increasing, all these other metrics are increasing, and we're doing good. We're right where we want to be. So this next equation, a little bit more labor intensive, but still not too bad. Volume load in kilos equals number of sets times number of reps times a percent of your 1 rep max. So you can see I have this chart here that from the NSCA. This is a rep max scale, and these are pretty useful. I normally only stick with out to 10 reps. Once you get past 10, there's some question over how accurate this is, and for women in particular, how accurate the rep max scale is. But for most people, you really just need a ballpark idea of where you are with your max. So this gives you an approximate percentage based off how many reps you're doing. So let's say we have 1 rep is all we can get. This is no shit 1 rep max. That is 100% of your 1 rep max. 2 reps, 95, 3, 93, 4, 90, and so on. So it gives you an approximate idea, which is good enough. I don't tend to push a lot of rep maxes. I used to think that was really important. Using this scale, it gets you an accurate enough assessment of where you are with your rep max and the percentage that you're working within that rep max, that it's, for me, it's just fine. So in the equation here in this example, our volume load, again, we're 10 sets of 4 reps. In this case, we'll be at 67%. Let's say we are lifting at 67%. And that gives, we're going to multiply that by 100 to give us a 2-digit number. Do the math on that, and we get 2,680 kilograms. So something to note on the second equation, you'll probably see that the volume load is lower compared to equation 1. So one way to account for that is to multiply equation 2 by 2 at the end of it to give you a more accurate picture of max capacity and the volume load relationship. The important thing is that you pick an equation and stick with it. I like the first equation better, but if you're looking at more specifically working in a percentage of your rep max, then it could be more appropriate for you to use this one. Other thing to consider, the goals of the athlete. If they're so laser focused for whatever reason on working on that percentage of rep max, it could be important there. Also, consider their goals and how their training should be structured. Strength athlete versus more hypertrophy-based training, 10 sets of 3 versus 3 sets of 10. What load you'd be working in for those particular set rep schemes could be very different. 10 sets of 3 at 90% of your 1 rep max versus 75 could yield vastly different results at the end of a training block. So it's just something to be considered. Just because the volume is equated in different styles of training doesn't necessarily mean the intensity is the same. You have to think about this critically and analyze what your goal is, how you're training, and then you can use volume as a metric after the fact. So you still have to structure your training around your goals. It's not just as simple as following the volume and expecting it to get you where you want to be. So really just stick with one, and I wouldn't worry about changing it up from there. But I will say that equation 1 could be more appropriate for individuals or small groups, that kind of thing. Equation 2 could be more appropriate for larger groups. It is probably easier when you're working in mass to just say, today we want you working in, say, 85% of your 1 rep max or 90%. I think football teams, when they get together, especially in like high school environments, when they're not doing their skills training, they're not breaking off in individual groups, they're working out all at the same, probably working out based on their performance. So rep max, for instance, you probably have a bunch of guys like the linemen, for example. They're probably going to lift together because the weight that they're using is going to be comparable from one person to the next. So it would be a lot easier to say, as a whole, we want everyone in here working north of 90% of the 1 rep max, and then you can do the math for them and have these large scales where you say 90% of a given weight is X amount on the bar. So you just tell them to do that, and it makes it so much easier, opposed to the other method where they're actually having to calculate it out. They use a rep max scale. It makes it a little bit easier to follow for groups. So on to RPE. RPE is a rate of perceived exertion, and it's really come a long way since it was first incorporated, which was initially used for aerobic training, endurance training, and then it was later adapted to suit resistance training, and it works very well. It's been vetted time and again, and RPE is a very good tool to use if you know how to use it, and we'll talk more on that later. But you have to understand that it takes some skill to learn what true RPE is for the individual. So basically, RPE is, how do you feel? Your rate of perceived exertion for a given task or the training as a whole. How do you feel? Do you feel really fatigued from this exercise or not so much? What is your training? You can structure your training where the RPE is the goal, and then you manipulate the load to suit that. If I want an RPE of 10, meaning max RPE, now we're thinking closer to a 1 rep max, because that's as intense as I can get for that individual. RPE of 8, 7, 6, whatever it is, I want to adjust the training to fit the RPE, assuming you're using RPE as your one of your monitoring variables. It's just a process of quantifying qualitative information. The qualitative information being the subjective, how the athlete feels. Turning it into an objective metric based on this scale here. The chart that you see here is this has been adapted from the original RPE scale to a rating of 0 to 10. And you can see here it goes from 0, which is at rest, all the way to 10, which is maximum effort, and everything in between. This even gets a little bit more detailed as you get half metrics in between. You get 7.5, 8.5, 9.5, so on, and that can equate to other aspects of training that we can go over next, which is RIR. Next thing we'll talk about is incorporating a stop. And this is where, if you don't know exactly how to incorporate this, you need to read up on it or ask someone who does know, because it can get really complicated here. But the general idea is it is just a backstop for your training. At what point are we deciding we need to stop training or move on to the next exercise or whatever? We're reaching a point of diminishing returns. We cannot train indefinitely and expect good results. We have to have some point where we establish our backstop for training. If you were to use RPE, for example, you'd say, at what RPE are we defining as a failure for that exercise? So if, let's say we're doing squats, and we want our athletes working at an RPE 8 to 9, so a pretty intense training session. If we're tracking their RPE throughout these exercises and they start dropping below the desired RPE, and they're hitting 6s and 7s, well, that's a problem, because that's not what our program calls for. So at what point do we say, we're not making any progress today, let's move on to the next thing? Other stops could be, you could have velocity stops, a failure of repetitions at a certain load, or IRRs. I mean, you can have any stop that you want. At some point, what objective metric are we going to use to determine we're done for the day, or we're done with this exercise for the day? At some point, if you're the coach and you're assessing this stuff, you got to figure out, when are we going to stop pushing these guys? We have to have something telling us that we need to stop. Personally, I like to see two consecutive failures. If you look at any given set, not every set's going to be ideal for a number of reasons. There's too many variables to come into play. So a single set, maybe it's good enough for you based on what you're seeing. You could say we need to stop here. We're not making any progress anymore. We'll revisit this in the next training session. I generally like to see two. If we're doing RPE, for example, and they hit two, we're trying to get to 8 to 9, and they hit two RPE sixes in a row. To me, that's saying we're not able to push as hard as we need to push. We've already accomplished that for today. We're good on this exercise, or maybe the training session as a whole. We're good for today. Let's stop here and we'll readjust. This allows you to train according to your plan. It allows you to consistently stay within certain boundaries that you've established. And it takes some time to consider when you're writing this program where you want these stops to be. Now I wouldn't incorporate stops for just anybody. These are going to be our competitive athletes, almost definitely in an off-season environment. That's how I would do it. You were trying to really push them. So there are, though that's a simple way of doing it, just looking at like an RPE stop or a load stop or whatever. There are way more complicated ways to do this that involve using formulas in Excel and all that. I have an Excel document that I've used, IF statements, according to the RPE and the rep max scale. I have a program that when the RPE drops below a certain point, it automatically adjusts the next load based on all the information, based on the original load. It's a very time-consuming process because this IFS statement is like really long, but you only got to get it right once. And once you get it right, it's a fantastic tool. There's a lot of applications that are out there that do this as well. I'm just not interested in paying for this stuff, but there are plenty of apps out there that can do this and remove the guesswork for you. You just got to dig around and find them. They're definitely out there, and it will help progress your training. I don't think there's any doubt about that. As long as your intensity is where it needs to be, using stops will help you progress. It's almost like you're removing all the junk volume, only focusing on RPE or whatever your stop is, only focusing on the good sets. All the other junk sets, we're doing away with those. All right, so let's have an example here. We'll consider a sprinter. An RPE stop may not work well for a sprinter. Let's say we're doing 40-yard sprints. The RPE stop may not be the most applicable monitoring tool for a sprinter. Instead, what if we use time? And then we use time based on previous 40-yard sprint times. At what percentage from their typical time, or the time that we want them to be running, at what percentage of time below that are we willing to accept? So let's say you establish 90% of that time as your stop. So when they drop below 90%, there's your stop right there. You can either choose to stop it once they get below 90%, or if you like my method, you want to see 2 of those failures in a row. Particularly with sprinting, a high skill activity like that, if it's outdoors and maybe they're laid off the blocks, or they're distracted by a car going by or something. There's a lot of variables that can come into play when you do this stuff live. Maybe that one failure isn't quite representative of where they are in that particular phase of training. So I like to see it twice. Once you see it twice, whatever you're going to do, you see the stop, and we're gonna, okay, so now we're done sprinting for the day, or we're done doing that exercise, we move on to something else. It helps you remove the guesswork from this stuff instead of just subjectively looking at the athlete and thinking, all right, maybe that's enough for today. You don't really know. So let's have a bit more objective perspective on this stuff. I think that's really important. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about is RIR, reps in reserve. It's a method of monitoring where the person performing the exercise will determine how many reps they would have left in reserve before they wouldn't be able to perform any more repetitions. It is an effective way of measuring intensity. Similar to RPE, it takes some experience lifting to really sort out what you can effectively determine as your RIR or your RPE. It takes practice. But with practice, you can get very good at it, and you'll see later on in this presentation how all these things are correlated. So in this chart here is an RIR scale that you can use. It's a simple way of looking at how many reps in reserve you have. So usually you'll see on the lower end of an RIR in a program, if I program for one of my clients an RIR of 2 to 3, that means I want them to be within 2 to 3 reps of failure on a given exercise. One RIR would be 1 repetition left. So if you can think about your own training, you can probably imagine how this can be viewed or used inappropriately if you don't truly know what failure feels like. And that's where the experience comes in. If you've never truly failed on a lift because of fatigue, not because of technique or form or skill, then you understand how RIR can be used and be effective. If you don't have that, then maybe you can play with it, but probably wouldn't use that. If you're just not familiar with that, wait until you are familiar with it and kind of go from there. So, so if you think about rep max scale, RPE and RIR, you can see they are all pretty well related. Some of the scientific literature that's come out over the years will use all of them to show how they are related. If you use them in combination with each other, it can be an effective style of training, or you can just use them independently and progress from there. Training experience, the time available, what equipment you have available, it may determine how you're able to use these different monitoring assets or different monitoring styles. I would, if you're unfamiliar with them and you don't know how it's going to affect your training or how you will feel during it, maybe give them a try. Give each of them a try for a week or so to see if you are actually able to use that as a method to determine your proximity to failure. And that's what this is all about, proximity to failure. That's what good training is going to set you up for, how close you are to failure. Next up is autoregulation. Autoregulation is a method of monitoring, allows you to self-regulate the training intensity or the load that you're using for any given training session. Autoregulation is, in my opinion, it's where the coaches want you to be. We're doing all this work, setting up your training, answering all these questions that you have throughout the process to get you to the point where you're able to auto-regulate and make these adjustments on your own. It's not quite as simple as just arbitrarily adding or dropping load. There's more to it than that, and it can get very complicated, or you can just keep it pretty simple. I think we all do this to some degree. Autoregulation is in simplest terms, it's just a way of adjusting your training for how you're performing that day or how you're feeling that day. And I think it's something to consider. It's not an excuse to have a light day, but it is an important consideration how you're performing that day with how you should adjust your load. If you're not performing optimally, or if you're so fatigued from previous training sessions earlier in the week, or maybe you're on your second or third training session that day, if you're not able to perform the way you normally would, or you feel like you normally should be able to, because of fatigue or because of some other reason, and an injury happens because of that, that's not good. That sets us way back, and then we'll have to come back to the drawing board and figure out what we have to adjust now, or we can try to implement auto-regulation, and you can make those adjustments on the fly. Just the conditions that you would want to consider for auto-regulation: environmental factors, like going to a new climate where it's hot or cold or rainy, things you're not used to, elevation maybe. Poor sleep is probably one of the most significant things that I see, at least in my training. Poor sleep will really affect my training the next day. Recovering from injuries, what other stresses you have in your life, because mental stress will affect you physically if you let it get out of hand. These are just things to consider when you're talking about auto-regulation. So instead of just deleting an entire training session or training block or whatever, just make some adjustments, lift a little bit lighter, maybe decrease the total training volume for that day, and keep pressing forward. A great example of auto-regulation would be deloads. Deloads is something I've changed my opinion on over time. I used to program in deloads every 3 to 4 weeks, and it's not a bad way of doing things. It's just, it's not necessary to program it in that way. I don't think it is anymore. I think it's deloads are perfectly fine and useful, but I would listen to the athlete more so than I would pre-program in the deload. They may be making some good progress over 3 to 4 weeks, especially if they're new to resistance training or new to a sport. They're probably going to grow by leaps and bounds up to maybe 8 weeks or more. If you're programming in a deload, it could set them back a little bit or stall that progress, but it doesn't need to be. The flip side of that, even if whatever time frame it is, 3 to 4 weeks, 8 weeks or longer, when the progress stalls and they continue to tell you that they're feeling fatigued and they're not recovering from the previous training sessions, if you haven't adjusted the volume already, even if you have, maybe incorporating a deload into their training is a good idea. Jared Feather, who's an IFBB professional bodybuilder, I heard him give a quote one time. It was something to the effect of, everybody takes deloads, whether they want to or not, whether they mean to or not. Point being, this idea that you can train hard and fast every training session all the time, it doesn't hold any water. There is no way that anybody can continuously train at 100% all the time. You have to take time. If you don't make the time to take off, your body's going to make you take time. And you'll see this through, it could be acute injuries or some other illness that creeps up on you because your immune system is depleted from all this hard training, or any other way that your body is trying to signal to you that it is fatigued and it needs a break. If you don't listen to your body, then you're going to be worse off for it, and eventually your body's going to make you take the time off. And if that happens, you're probably going to wind up way worse off than you would have if you just simply dialed the intensity down a little bit and pushed from there. It would have made it way easier, and it's a lot less you have to adjust later on. So the theory of auto-regulation, it's more complicated than just arbitrarily adjusting the load of the training volume based on how you're feeling. There is a form of autoregulation called APRE. It's autoregulatory progressive resistance exercise, and this goes back to the stops that we were talking about earlier. You can have your stops based on whatever metric you want. APRE uses RPE in some cases for the stops, and I think that's a really effective way to do it. And RPE is great in terms of autoregulation because RPE is a subjective metrics. Autoregulation itself is subjective, but you can take that information and you can quantify it. So this method allows you to continue to keep progressing based on RPE stops. You can use RIR as well, as long as you have something in place that allows you to have a stop of whatever metric that is. I would think of APRE as kind of a blending of all these concepts. If you consider a set RPE of like 8, and then your athlete is getting to 9, RPE 9 each time. Well, that's too much. That's not where we want to be. Not that in itself an RPE 9 is a bad thing, but we want to be at RPE 8, and here we are at 9. That's not what we want. So we need to dial back that intensity. As a coach, if I'm monitoring somebody's workout and I want them at 8 and they're at 9, I am going to make that adjustment for them. I'm going to make the call to drop the intensity down some, probably just drop the load. What the coach needs eventually is to lay out the training plan and have this athlete make that determination. And you can do this in different ways. There are apps that do this also, or you can use Excel with IF statements and all that. It works just fine. All right, so on to our summary here. We've talked about a lot of things: RIR, RPE, autoregulation, all these things. They have one big thing in common, and that is that it's taking objective measures to monitor the training. So the overall point of all this stuff is that you have some way of monitoring your training. This stuff, I bring it up because it's been vetted in the literature time and time again. So we know that it works. We know that this stuff is useful. Even if we aren't calling it this stuff, we're using a different term to describe these things in different applications that you may see that you can download to do essentially the same stuff. This is what it is. This is what it boils down to, is just having some way of looking at this stuff objectively so you can track your progress. I think what's important is, one, finding what works for you. What do you think would be the simplest way to implement these things? But don't forget that you can combine all of these or certain parts of them, whichever one is going to help you the best. Technology will help you a lot. There's so much stuff that's out there. Force plates are really awesome in the laboratory environment. Outside of that, if I were to get one thing that I would really help you monitor your training, be some sort of accelerometer. There's all kinds of these things available. Some that just attach straight to the bar. Others that you have a little rope that is weighted down by a weight or whatever the little block is, that will measure velocity, because velocity stops are another very useful tool, along with the other stops that we talked about. So when you decrease your velocity to a certain point, you know that you're either getting close to your 1 rep max, or your training performance for that day is starting to wither away. So there's a lot of really cool stuff out there. A lot of it is based on the things that we've talked about today. Either way you look at it, objective metrics are the way to go. If you can have some sort of objective way of tracking your training, you'll be better off for it. So, as always, I like to put my references for all my information up there so you can go and look for this stuff yourself. It's right here. Don't be afraid to look at this stuff yourself. Really, if you find one good study that talks about these things and then you look at the references of those studies, you can go down the rabbit hole on this stuff and you can find all kinds of information for whatever you're looking for. So I hope this helps. Find a way to monitor your training, or have a coach that knows how to monitor your training. Do something so you can keep moving forward. Thanks.